Imagine a quiet London evening in Shepherd's Bush. The streets hum with life, the occasional bus rumbling past, the faint scent of takeout from the corner shop, the laughter of children fading into the distance. Nestled among the rows of tidy Victorian terraces is a flat that, from the outside, looks ordinary. But inside, a story was unfolding that would shock a nation. Albert Alfonso, 62, and Paul Longworth, 71, had lived here for years. Their lives were a patchwork of routines, small pleasures, and shared history. Albert, meticulous and kind, enjoyed arranging the flat just so, taking pride in every corner. Paul, easygoing and thoughtful, loved cooking elaborate meals and tinkering with small projects. Together, they had built a life of comfort, trust, and companionship. On one seemingly ordinary day, a stranger appeared. He was Yastin Andres Mascara, a man whose charm and charisma disguised the darkness he carried. To the casual observer, he was polite, friendly, and engaging. He laughed easily, carried himself with confidence, and seemed eager to help wherever he could. Albert and Paul, ever trusting, welcomed him into their home. Little did they know, this small act of kindness would be the first step toward unimaginable horror. Right from the start, Mascara began to learn their routines, studying the rhythms of their days. He asked questions that seemed innocent. Where did they keep valuables? What times did they leave the flat? He listened attentively, noting patterns and quirks. It was the behavior of someone who wanted to belong. But beneath the friendly smile lurked a mind calculating, planning, and preparing. Then came the evening that would change everything. The flat, normally a sanctuary, became a place of shadows. Paul Longworth was alone when Mascara struck first. A hammer, silent at first, then crushing in its final impact, ended Paul's life in the very room he had felt safest. The horror of that moment is almost impossible to imagine. The life of a man ended under the roof that had always sheltered him. But Mascara's violence did not stop there. Hours later, Albert Alfonso fell victim. What began as a seemingly ordinary encounter turned into a stabbing, carried out with precision, brutality, and cold calculation. Recordings captured parts of the crime, an almost surreal documentation of violence. It was as if the act itself fascinated Mascara, a grotesque performance carried out in a place that had once been a home. Here is the moment where the story demands your attention. Right now, viewers, imagine the trust these men gave, the ordinary lives they led, and the terrifying intrusion of a stranger who would betray that trust in the most horrific way imaginable. Before we continue, I need you to stay with this story. It only gets darker, and the choices made that night will leave you questioning the limits of human cruelty. Subscribe and turn on notifications now if you want to see how the stranger turned their lives into a nightmare, and the shocking methods he used that no one could have predicted. After the attacks, the flat became a scene of unimaginable horror. Mascara moved with methodical care, hiding the bodies, dismembering parts, and preparing them for transport. A chest freezer, innocuous to an outsider, became a tool of concealment. Each decision, each step, reflected the cold calculation of a man who had thought through every element of his crime. Investigators later uncovered digital evidence revealing the meticulous planning. Online searches on fatal injuries, body storage, and disposal methods. These searches were no spur-of-the-moment decisions. They were the blueprint for a murder that had been carefully considered, a roadmap of violence. Every aspect of Mascara's plan showed foresight and planning. It was premeditation on a scale that left detectives shaken. Neighbors, at first, noticed only subtle oddities. Packages delivered at unusual hours, a man moving suitcases quietly through the building, noises that didn't make sense. Nothing seemed out of place enough to raise alarm. Yet, unbeknownst to anyone, the ordinary had become extraordinary in the worst possible way. The trust that Albert and Paul extended became the very weapon that ended their lives. This story is not only about the shocking acts themselves but also about the psychological tension, the betrayal, and the stark contrast between ordinary domestic life and the horrors that can invade it. It's about how a friendly smile and casual charm can mask a mind capable of plotting the unimaginable. The streets of Shepherd's Bush, the flat they called home, and even the objects in their daily lives, freezer, furniture, kitchen tools, were transformed into instruments of terror. The ordinary can become horrifying, and trust can be a dangerous gamble. The tension is only beginning. What Mascara did next, the journey he embarked upon with his grisly cargo, and the audacity of attempting to transport body parts across counties. The story is cinematic, terrifying, and real. Albert and Paul's lives were stolen not by chance but by design. And as you watch, you'll see how each decision led to a cascade of horror that captured the attention of law enforcement and a shocked public alike. The morning after the fateful night, Shepherd's Bush remained deceptively calm. Sunlight filtered through the curtains of Albert and Paul's flat, falling across the same furniture that had once been a backdrop for comfort and laughter. To the casual passerby, everything appeared normal. Birds chirping outside, the low hum of traffic, and the faint aroma of breakfast that lingered from a previous evening. Yet inside, the flat had become a chamber of terror, a place where the ordinary had been shattered into something unrecognizable. Paul Longworth's life had ended under the bed, a crushing blow from a hammer delivered by a man he had trusted. Albert Alfonso, meanwhile, had fallen victim to a meticulously planned assault, stabbed repeatedly in a scene that combined both shocking violence and chilling calculation. Mascara had treated the flat as a stage, executing each act with precision, almost as if following a rehearsed script. It was a level of premeditation that left detectives later describing it as almost cinematic in its horror. Every item in the flat told a story. The chest freezer, once an innocuous domestic appliance, now contained evidence of a gruesome transformation of everyday life. Body parts were stored inside, decapitated and dismembered, organized in a way that spoke to careful thought rather than frenzied panic. The bloodstains, the placement of items, the silent order in the midst of chaos. It all revealed the mind of someone methodical, someone who had meticulously planned each step. Investigators would later piece together the timeline through a combination of CCTV footage, delivery records, and digital traces. Mascara had ordered the freezer days before, claiming domestic need. He had researched fatal blows to the head and methods of concealing a body. Every action he took, from purchasing tools to arranging the freezer and planning the route to Bristol, reflected a level of calculated evil that was almost unfathomable. The flat, normally filled with warmth and life, now held a silence that was suffocating. Every corner seemed to echo with questions. How could someone so familiar transform into a predator? How could the ordinary, the routine, be so violently invaded? Investigators entering the scene later described a mixture of horror and disbelief. The quiet, ordinary space of a flat now bearing the marks of premeditated murder, recording equipment capturing moments of cruelty that no one could have imagined. Neighbors began to piece together small anomalies. Deliveries that didn't match any recollection. The sound of heavy boxes being moved at odd hours. Glimpses of a man carrying large suitcases with an awkwardness that hinted at concealment. To most, it seemed minor. To investigators, in retrospect, it became crucial evidence. Breadcrumbs leading to the understanding of how Mascara had moved through the flat, how he had managed to hide and transport the bodies, and how his planning extended far beyond the confines of that small London space. The psychological dimension of the crime is as chilling as the physical acts themselves. Mascara had cultivated trust, understood routines, and manipulated familiarity to gain proximity. Albert and Paul were unaware that each friendly conversation, each shared laugh, had given him information he would use to orchestrate their deaths. Trust had been weaponized in the most brutal way imaginable. Every detail of the murders was steeped in method. Paul was killed first, his body concealed immediately under the bed, a space chosen carefully to delay discovery. Albert's murder followed, executed during an encounter that Mascara had staged. The recording devices that captured aspects of the crime later revealed the calculated nature of the act. There was no frenzy, no impulsive violence. It was deliberate, precise, almost clinical. In the days following the murders, Mascara's planning extended beyond the flat. He began preparing for the transportation of body parts, ensuring that his trail would be as untraceable as possible. Suitcases were lined, compartments organized, and every step accounted for. Even when moving large items like the freezer, he maintained a facade of ordinary behavior, hiding the horror beneath a veneer of domestic normality. Detectives would later describe the investigation as both painstaking and surreal. Digital evidence was critical, search histories on fatal blows, freezer capacity, and disposal methods revealed not just premeditation but an almost obsessive attention to detail. Witnesses recalled seeing a man behaving strangely with suitcases, but only after cross-referencing footage from multiple locations did investigators realize the magnitude of the crime. The flat itself became a character in the story, a silent witness to horror. Furniture bore stains, corners concealed evidence, and the chest freezer held a grim secret. Every photograph, every report, every piece of evidence built a narrative that was as horrific as it was methodical. The investigators worked tirelessly, piecing together a timeline, reconstructing the murders, and understanding the steps Mascara had taken to avoid detection. And yet, the story of that night extends beyond the flat. The journey Mascara would soon undertake with the suitcases of human remains marked a chilling escalation. It was a movement from domestic horror to public risk, from hidden violence to a nearly cinematic attempt at disposing of evidence. The city streets, the quiet corners of Bristol, and the looming Clifton Suspension Bridge would soon become the stage for the next act of this horrifying saga. The quiet streets of Shepherd's Bush no longer held their usual calm. Inside the flat, a chest freezer had concealed evidence of unspeakable horrors. But Mascara's plan was far from over. The killings had been executed with precision, the bodies dismembered and hidden, yet the next stage, the disposal, required movement, courage, and audacity that few could imagine. Mascara's journey began with the preparation of 2 large suitcases, lined and packed meticulously with human remains. Each movement was deliberate, every zipper closed with care, each corner cushioned to avoid spillage. It was not haphazard. It was premeditated. The weight of the suitcases reflected the gravity of his crimes, yet Mascara carried them with an air of confidence, as if what he was doing were nothing more than a mundane errand. He had planned the route across England carefully. From London, he would travel west to Bristol, choosing paths that minimized the risk of being seen. The streets blurred past him as he drove, a man who had crossed the boundary between human decency and the abyss. The hum of tires against asphalt, the quiet drone of the engine, contrasted sharply with the horror contained in the luggage beside him. The ordinary sounds of a car journey could not mask the extraordinary evil of his intentions. As Mascara approached Bristol, the anticipation of the disposal plan sharpened the tension. The Clifton Suspension Bridge, a landmark of elegance and engineering, became the stage for his next act. He arrived at night, the bridge lit by sparse streetlights that cast long, dramatic shadows. The River Avon below stretched dark and silent, masking its depths in mystery. It was here that he intended to dispose of the suitcases, leaving the evidence to sink into oblivion. The first suitcase was hoisted carefully over the railing, the weight straining against his arms. Each movement measured, as if he were performing an act that had been rehearsed countless times in his mind. But something went wrong. The second suitcase drew attention. Passers-by, joggers, and late-night drivers noticed a man acting strangely. Some glanced at the suitcases. Some looked away, assuming they were heavy luggage being transported for ordinary reasons. Yet Mascara's nervous glances betrayed him. And then the moment of near exposure arrived. A police patrol had been alerted by reports of suspicious behavior. Mascara realized too late that his movements were being observed. Panic flared in his chest, a stark contrast to the calm he had maintained for months. He abandoned the remaining suitcase in haste, fleeing the scene on foot, weaving between streetlights and shadows. The Clifton Suspension Bridge, meant to conceal his crimes, had almost become the location of his undoing. This flight across the bridge added a new layer of cinematic tension to the narrative. Audiences can visualize him darting across the bridge, carrying the burden of his crimes, heart pounding, every step a gamble between freedom and capture. The ordinary structures of the city, sidewalks, railings, traffic, became props in a suspense thriller, each element amplifying the tension of a man on the brink. The journey back to safety was not complete, yet the audacity of what he had attempted stunned investigators. Transporting human remains in suitcases across counties is a feat few would dare, and yet he had done it. Each decision, from selecting the route to attempting the disposal, revealed a mind capable of meticulous planning, cold calculation, and moral detachment that was almost impossible to fathom. Meanwhile, authorities were piecing together his movements. CCTV cameras, previously ignored by casual passersby, now provided a detailed account of Mascara's actions. From the flat in Shepherd's Bush to the streets of Bristol, every frame revealed the audacity and recklessness of a man caught between careful planning and human error. Witnesses' reports were cross-referenced, traffic patterns analyzed, and the timeline reconstructed. Investigators were building a narrative that not only revealed what had happened but also how Mascara had attempted to evade detection. The psychological tension of the story deepened. Mascara had managed to keep his composure during the murders, but the transport of the bodies added a new kind of stress. Every glance from a passerby, every vehicle passing by, every shadow cast by streetlights was a potential exposure. The ordinary world outside, the traffic, the nighttime pedestrians, the calm of the river, stood in stark contrast to the horror contained within the suitcases and the desperation of a man fleeing. And yet, the story is not just about suspense, it is also about inevitability. Mascara's meticulous planning, which had allowed him to commit the murders and prepare the bodies for disposal, could not account for chance encounters, human observation, and the vigilance of law enforcement. The same meticulousness that had enabled his crimes was slowly becoming the evidence that would ensure his capture. Part 4. The morning after the failed disposal attempt, the air in Shepherd's Bush felt heavy, thick with the scent of decay and secrecy. Police sirens cut through the early hours as detectives closed in on the flat. What had once seemed like an ordinary home was about to become the centerpiece of one of the most disturbing crime scenes in recent memory. Neighbors stood by their windows, curious, anxious, watching as officers in white forensic suits entered with gloved precision. Inside, investigators were met with a silence that felt almost alive. The chest freezer hummed faintly, its cold breath filling the room with a whisper of what lay inside. When they lifted the lid, even the most seasoned officers froze. Inside were dismembered human remains, carefully wrapped and arranged. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, controlled, and horrifyingly organized. The names on the lease, Albert Alfonso and Paul Longworth, soon became the focus of national headlines. Two kind-hearted men, generous to a fault, whose home had been turned into a slaughterhouse. Friends described them as warm, open, and trusting. They had offered a roof and friendship to someone who needed help, only to be betrayed in the most unimaginable way. The investigation quickly turned to the one person who had access to the flat and reason to flee, Julius Mascara. CCTV footage showed him traveling westward, lugging heavy suitcases, glancing nervously over his shoulder. The footage from the Clifton Suspension Bridge confirmed what police had suspected. He had attempted to dispose of the bodies, but abandoned one suitcase in his panic. The suitcase would become one of the most damning pieces of evidence. Inside, police found more human remains, sealed in bags and wrapped meticulously. Mascara didn't get far. His face was already circulating through media and law enforcement channels. When police cornered him days later, he was calm, almost indifferent. There was no dramatic chase, no violent resistance, just a quiet surrender, the same cold composure he had shown in his crimes. In interrogation, he maintained his silence for hours. Detectives pressed him with evidence, CCTV footage, forensic reports, and digital records of his online searches about dismemberment and disposal. Each question was met with calculated pauses, each answer clipped and emotionless. It wasn't denial. It was detachment. He didn't deny his role. He simply refused to acknowledge the horror of what he had done. The trial that followed was one of the most chilling in recent British memory. The prosecution laid out the events in excruciating detail, how Mascara had gained the victims' trust, how he had planned their murders, and how he had methodically dismembered and attempted to dispose of their bodies. Jurors watched evidence projected on screens. Grainy security footage, forensic photos, and charts mapping his movements across England. Every image drew gasps from the courtroom. Witnesses described Mascara as charming at first, polite, even helpful. But beneath that surface was a disturbing calm, a vacancy that hinted at something darker. Experts testified about his psychological profile, painting a picture of a man capable of extreme calculation and emotional void. He didn't kill in rage. He killed with intent. As the evidence mounted, the weight of the crimes became undeniable. The suitcase, the freezer, the bridge, each detail revealed a layer of planning that stunned even the prosecution. The forensic pathologist spoke softly, describing how the cuts were precise, how tools had been selected with purpose. It was as if Mascara had studied his method long before he acted. Family members of Albert and Paul filled the courtroom, their faces a mix of grief and disbelief. For them, justice could never balance the scales. They listened as the details of their loved ones' final moments were laid bare, as prosecutors described the trust that was shattered, the kindness that was exploited, and the calculated cruelty that followed. Each testimony cut deeper than the last. When the verdict was read, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Guilty on all counts. Life imprisonment with no realistic chance of parole. Mascara sat still, his expression unchanged. No emotion, no remorse, no visible reaction. It was as if the verdict meant nothing to him, as though the humanity required to feel consequence had long since vanished. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed and reporters shouted over one another. The case had captured national attention not just for its brutality, but for its sheer audacity. The thought that someone could live among others, eat meals with them, share their space, and then turn their home into a scene of unimaginable horror. The public couldn't look away. Investigators who had worked the case spoke later about how it haunted them. Some couldn't sleep for weeks, others transferred to different departments. The images from that flat, the cold logic of Mascara's actions, stayed with them long after the case closed. The question that echoed most often wasn't just how he did it, but why. What made him cross that line? What turned an ordinary man into someone capable of such deliberate cruelty? Psychologists who studied the case suggested that Mascara's crimes were rooted not in impulse, but in power, a need for control, for dominance, for a kind of cold superiority that thrived on secrecy. Killing wasn't just an act of violence for him. It was a demonstration of control, and dismemberment was the ultimate expression of it. The case left deep scars on everyone it touched. The families of Albert and Paul carried their grief like a shadow. For the LGBTQ+ community, the murders felt especially cruel, a reminder that trust and openness, the very things that build connection, could sometimes invite unimaginable betrayal. Their names became symbols of vulnerability and strength, spoken in vigils and remembered in stories that refused to let them fade into the statistics of crime. Years later, the apartment on the quiet London street remained empty for months. The hum of the freezer was long gone, but those who lived nearby swore that the place never felt the same. Tenants came and went, but none stayed long. Some said the walls carried a chill, others that the air felt wrong, as if the horror that had once lived there had seeped into the very foundation. In documentaries and online discussions, the case continued to fascinate and horrify. True crime communities dissected every detail, the psychology, the logistics, the eerie composure of Mascara. But beneath the intrigue, one truth persisted. This was not just a story of evil. It was a story of trust betrayed, of ordinary kindness met with extraordinary cruelty, and of how darkness can hide behind the most familiar faces. In the end, justice was served, but the sense of unease remained. The image of Mascara crossing the Clifton Suspension Bridge at night, carrying suitcases that held what was left of two innocent lives, became the defining symbol of the case. A perfect snapshot of evil wrapped in calm, moving through the world as if nothing had happened. For the detectives who worked tirelessly to uncover the truth, there was a grim satisfaction in knowing he would never walk free again. But there was no victory here, only closure of the most painful kind. In interviews, one investigator put it best: "You don't walk away from something like that unchanged. You just learn to live with what you've seen." The story of Albert Alfonso and Paul Longworth is one that stays with you, not because of the horror alone, but because of what it says about the human condition. Trust, compassion, and friendship, values that make us human, were weaponized by someone who had none left in him. And in the end, that's what makes it so haunting. If you've made it this far, take a moment to remember them, not for how their lives ended, but for how they lived. Two good men whose kindness was exploited, whose names now serve as a warning and a legacy. And if stories like this move you, disturb you, and make you want to see justice carried forward, don't forget to subscribe, stay with us, and keep watching. Because the world is full of stories just like this, stories that remind us that evil hides in plain sight, and truth is the only light that can expose it.